Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Tran, and I am the project assistant for the Madison History Club. I want to welcome you all to today's lecture, Still Fighting 70 Years Later, The Strange Afterlife of World War II in Japan and Asia, which will be presented by Professor Louise Young. Thank you to all the members of the History Club, as well as students and faculty who are joining us today, and thanks especially to Professor Young for sharing her research with us. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the moment of historical rupture that we're all living through right now. The murder of George Floyd by a white police officer in Minneapolis, yet another calamity in a devastating series of Black people's deaths at the hands of police, has horrified us. This pain and anger has sparked protests and unrest in cities across the United States and the world, including in Madison, as protesters demand justice, an end to police brutality, and systemic change in a society that has too often determined Black lives to be expendable. The contemporary injustices, anti-Blackness, and institutional racism that Americans protest against today are deeply rooted in the anguished history of enslavement and white supremacy. I encourage us all to take on part of the immense labor needed to create change. I'm now going to briefly introduce Professor Young and run through some logistics for our conversation today, and then I'll hand things over to Professor Young. Louise Young is Professor of History here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where her research and teaching focuses on Japanese international relations, World War II in Asia, comparative imperialism, and urban history. Professor Young is herself an alumna of UW-Madison. She earned her BA here before going on to Columbia for her MA and PhD. Her first book, Japan's Total Empire, Manchuria, and the Culture of Wartime Imperialism, received the John K. Fairbank Prize from the American Historical Association, as well as the Hiromi Arisawa Prize Award from the Association of American University Presses. Her second book is Beyond the Metropolis, Second Cities and Modern Life in Interwar Japan. Earlier this spring, Professor Young was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a distinguished honor that recognizes Professor Young's excellence in her field and her long record of accomplishment. So on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to say congratulations, Professor Young. Professor Young will give her lecture on the legacies and memory of World War II in Japan, and then we'll have question and answer time afterwards. At that point, if you have a question, please raise your hand by clicking on the button at the center bottom of your screen. After I call your name, you'll see two new buttons, a camera and a microphone, appear at the bottom of your screen, and you can click those to turn on your camera and unmute your microphone so you can ask your question. Please keep your questions brief so that everyone has a chance to speak. And with that, I'll turn things over now to Professor Young.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really excited for this opportunity, and also to engage with people from the History Club, which I've heard so much about, and it sounds like a really cool thing. So let's see. Let me start by just saying that what the sort of topic that I'll be lecturing on today is World War II memory, the memory politics in Japan. And when we talk about memory politics and World War II memory issues, these really encompass an enormous number of issues, and not the least a kind of general sense of apology for aggression and violence towards that accompanied Japan's occupations of its Asian neighbors over the past century and a half. And we're aware of these issues because they've become diplomatic issues, but they're also very prominent domestic political issues in Japan as well. And some of these issues some of the World War II memory issues relate to the conduct of the war against the Allied powers. So for example, the whole issue of treatment of POWs and the treatment of the Dutch POWs, of the American POWs, of the British POWs. That those issues have triggered a lot of controversy. But the real kind of emotional investment in World War II kind of anchors to the relationship and the history of Japan and Asia. So the question that really sort of prompts this lecture today is, here we are in 2020. It's over 70 years after Japan's surrender. And why are these issues still so heated? Why are they still so present? Why are we still fighting over the conduct and interpretation of World War II? And Japan has been accused of historical amnesia. That's a sort of a phrase that gets thrown around a lot when we talk about Japan and World War II memory, that Japan does not face up to its violent past. But I don't think that amnesia is really the right term here, because this is not about forgetting. I don't think there's ever been forgetting. I think that these issues have, appeared and disappeared and reappeared and redisappeared, and that sort of process punctuates the history of the last 70 years. And so in the presentation I'm going to give you today, I'm going to try to account for that, the appearing and the disappearing, and the kind of timing of the politics of apologies. And so I'm going to divide my talk into 3 chronological periods. And the first one is what I'm going to call looking the other way. And here, this first phase covers the period from the end of the war to 1972. So what happens in the immediate aftermath of World War II? Well, 3.5 million Japanese soldiers come home from theaters of war across Asia and the Pacific. And it's kind of an extended demobilization and repatriation. And this happens in late 45 and well into 1946. And while the soldiers are coming home, and people are kind of coming to grips with the meanings and the trauma of defeat and loss, domestic newspapers begin publishing accounts of Japanese atrocities in the war zone. They publish accounts of the Bataan Death March. They publish accounts of the mass killings in the Philippines. They publish accounts of the killings in Malaysia. And they publish especially accounts of the Nanjing massacre and atrocities in China. And the kind of among the Japanese public, as the soldiers are coming back, this horror at the violent aspect of what they'd been, what during the war was known as co-prosperity in Asia, so-called co-prosperity in Asia. This sort of horror then fused with the shock of defeat and a sense that the wartime leadership had failed the public and had deceived them. Now, one of the key instruments of public opinion in this period was, specifically on the question of atrocities and war crimes, was the Tokyo War Crimes Trial of 1946 to 48. And there's a lot that we could say about the War Crimes Trial, but I just want to make a couple of points. One, that this was one of many war crimes trial. It was the show trial and was held in Tokyo. That was where everybody kind of concentrated their attention. There were other myriad war crimes trials carried out across Asia and in other countries where to try Japanese military people for war crimes. But this was the one where most of the attention was kind of paid. And the Tokyo trial basically put a handful of the wartime leadership on trial and found them guilty of a conspiracy to wage aggressive war. And the kind of whole process of the trial, the narrative of history that was produced and disseminated through the trial proceedings, served to reinforce a sense of separation of the Japanese public from their military leaders, and also to kind of cement a sense that the leaders were the agents of the war, the leaders were the aggressors, and the people were the passive victims. And so one of the common phrases that emerges out of these years is the phrase, "We were deceived," damasarita, we were deceived. And embedded in this phrase was the sense that the war was engineered by arrogant and reckless military leaders, and that the people became the victims of this of their leadership. The people became the cannon fodder. And so what you have out of this, what you have coming out of this is a widespread so-called victims consciousness, the victims consciousness that becomes really a core element of post-war ideology. And all of this inaugurates a process whereby the Japanese public focused their attention on the homeland and on domestic suffering rather than the suffering in the empire that they had lost. So in other words, they looked the other way. They didn't look at Asia. They looked within. They focused their attention at home. Now they were this whole looking the other way was aided and abetted by the kind of regional geopolitics of the 50s and 60s, and so where different stakeholders in the region really provided cover for this kind of not engaging in a sense of responsibility towards the crimes that had occurred in Asia. So America was part of this. In the initial phase of the American occupation that went on from 45 to 1952, the early phase of the occupation focused on demilitarization and democratization. But within a couple of years, the sort of focus of American policy changed course to really promote the rebuilding of Japan into a strong American Cold War aims in Asia. And as part of this, the United States helped to engineer a kind of a reset of the relationship between Japan and its former colonies, whereby the United States began to really put a lot of pressure on Taiwan, on South Korea, on Southeast Asian countries to kind of give up or soften their demands for reparations and compensation, and in the process, the United States assisted kind of reestablishing the foothold of Japanese companies in post-war Asia to sort of reestablish an economic relationship. And in a lot of ways, this American Cold War policy really, this was a lost opportunity for reconciliation, for a different kind of accountability and closure for the victims of Japanese colonialism. So America provided cover. Interestingly, and kind of ironically, the People's Republic of China also provided cover for looking away. This seems kind of counterintuitive, but the PRC did not actually press Japan hard for reparations or highlight this wartime history in the 50s and 60s. And so why was this? That seems weird. Well, one reason was that the Chinese nationalists who, after 1949, they'd lost the war and now they were over in Taiwan, nationalists that really bore the brunt of the fighting with Japan. And so the PRC didn't want to push for reparations or compensation or do anything to glorify the Republic of China and the nationalists and their war of resistance to Japan, because that would just be a gift to Taiwan, and they didn't want to give any gifts to Taiwan. And at the same time, the PRC was really desperate for economic development assistance, and were trying to kind of court Japanese businesses during this period, off and on in the 50s and 60s, which is something that the Japanese businesses also were very interested in. So, and to that end, neither party really wanted to kind of dig into those really painful of wartime atrocities. So, in that sense, both America and mainland China kind of were complicit in this looking away. So then the final thing that I want to point out about kind of regional geopolitics in the early aftermath of Japan's defeat that aided and abetted this kind of choosing not to examine this path, what you might call third-party decolonization. So after Japan's surrender in 1945, the Japanese state renounces its claims to overseas territory, and it's to its empire, and the future of this empire, these imperial territories, is decided via treaties, the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the Treaty of Taipei. So what does this mean? It means that the fate of the Japanese empire is not determined by a revolutionary party, anti-colonial nationalist party declaring independence. There's no war of independence, but rather it's the Allied powers forcing a defeated Japan to relinquish its empire. This is through third-party decolonization, and it considerably muddies the waters in terms of forcing Japan to account directly for the history of violence and exploitation, because now you have this third party in there mediating the post-colonial relationship between former colonizer and former colonized. And moreover, after Japan, decolonizes, after Japan departs, what happened then was not independence, but in most cases, recolonization. So a new aggressor replaces Japan. So for example, Taiwan is basically recolonized by the Chinese nationalists after they lose the civil war on the mainland. The colony of Korea becomes split between Cold War hegemons and becomes these sort of twin authoritarian client states. And in Southeast Asia, the European empires spend, the better part of a decade trying to reestablish control after Japan's defeat. So the Dutch try to get back into Indonesia, the French try to get back into Indochina, and the British reestablish their position in Hong Kong and Malaya. And so third-party decolonization really matters because it deflects attention. It allows, the Japanese public to deflect attention onto other colonialisms, other imperialisms, and also allows the Japanese public to find a kind of common cause with other client states within the American Cold War imperium. Because really what happens in the 50s and 60s is that a lot of people in Japan come to regard themselves as, sort of fellow victims of US imperialism, and is kind of a semi-colonized within the US sphere of influence. So when Japan militarily, when Japan withdraws militarily and politically from Asia, that power vacuum then becomes quickly filled by American and Chinese and Russian rivalries in the region. And really, us, the 50s and 60s, and into the 70s, Asia is consumed by hot wars. The Cold War are hot wars in Asia. You start with the Korean War, and then that's followed quickly by the Vietnam War. And in the middle of that, there's a host of anti-colonial insurgencies in Southeast Asia. And there simply is no attention spared here among the former colonies of Japan to pursue justice and accountability. And with nobody challenging them to examine history from the perspective of the former colonies, the Japanese public debated the meaning of their catastrophic war in other terms. There was lots of soul searching. There was lots of debate. There was lots of, there was not, historical amnesia about the war itself. Japanese public spent, during this time, analyzed, poured lots of energy and time into analyzing, what went wrong, the flaws in their economic system, in the pre-war economic system, the structural flaws in their political system, what was wrong with their ideology, what was wrong, what went wrong, all the different things. And they examined the road to war in terms of, who went along and who didn't, who resisted, and they came up with a politics of never again that could kind of, that everybody could kind of get behind across the political spectrum. And this sense of kind of never again became the foundation or the anchor of a mood of what I call peace nationalism. And sort of grounding peace nationalism it really emerges out of the mood of atonement and self-examination of this period. And so, what is peace nationalism? Well, to understand peace nationalism, you have to realize that in the wake of defeat, like such a catastrophic defeat, the symbols of pre-war nationalism are no longer available. They are discredited. The kind of like pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, the whole idea of military self-strengthening and military-led modernization, the striking rise of Japan on the world stage and becoming a world power, that you couldn't take pride in that. The colonial empire itself, these are no longer available. So what is available as a kind of basis of national unity, national identity, and national pride? Well, one of the things that really emerges is the fact that Japan was the kind of unique country to suffer an atomic attack. Japan was the unique victim of the A-bomb, of this bomb, this terrifying new weapon that is transforming the world. The world is utterly different after those bombs were dropped. We're now living in a nuclear age, and in the nuclear age affects everyone in the world. The world will never be the same. And when you're living in the shadow of nuclear holocaust, this gives Japan, Japan a special kind of responsibility and opportunity. That's what people start to believe, and they realize that their unique knowledge and unique suffering of what the experience of the atomic bomb can be used to kind of salvage something from the horrors of this war, to find some kind of meaning in an otherwise just like senseless devastation. That help, then that begins to kind of provide an opportunity to universalize the meaning of never again. And so this is part of peace nationalism. Leadership in the global ban the bomb movement. Peace nationalism is also expressed in the embrace and the support of the post-war Constitution, the 1947 Constitution. And this is kind of interesting because this Constitution was in a way, kind of rammed down, the U.S. occupation rammed this Constitution down the throats of a reluctant Japanese government. And it could have become the symbol of American imperialism, American hubris, and something like that. But it didn't. No, it became, the Japanese public embraced this Constitution, and they call it the Peace Constitution, and it's revered for and is part of the commitment is anchored to Article 9, which is the article that renounces the right of the Japanese state to wage aggressive war. So, peace nationalism. I'm going to move now to the next section, which I'm calling what goes from the 72 to 1995, next 20 years. And I call this period the period of the kind of rediscovery of Japanese colonial violence. And this is a period when the kind of public ideology, nationalism gets a reset, and Japanese relations with Asia become reframed within a understanding or a consciousness of that history of colonialism and aggression. So why do we have a shift? Why is there a shift in public attitudes? Well, it's 1972, Nixon goes to China, and that reopens, that's the end of containment, the containment of China that the Japanese government had been forced to go along with. And this opens the way to now, full kind of cultural interaction between Japan and China, and Sino-Japanese rapprochement. A peace treaty is finally signed in 1978. And as part of this, Japanese Japanese journalists go over and start traveling into China, and they rediscover the history of Japan's military action, Japanese military action in China, and begin to publish articles on Japanese atrocities and push the Japanese public to face up to this history of violence and aggression in China. And there's one journalist in particular who sort of leads the way here, a man named Honda Katsuichi. And he goes in late 1971 and he begins writing a series of just absolutely graphic and unflinching reports on the Nanjing Massacre of 1937. These are later published in a book form, and they just expose this, it's a new kind of re-exposure to the Japanese public of those atrocities that had been, briefly, revealed in the press in the early months after Japan's defeat. And partially as a result of that, this triggers its own kind of backlash and of the emergence of right-wing revisionism among a whole group of right-wing scholars who respond with their own books and articles that minimize and excuse Japan's action. And at the same time, making it sort of the politics of this even more a little complicated, the government is now, from this point on, the government treatment of textbook, government treatment of the history of the war in textbooks, in public school textbooks, comes under increasing scrutiny and controversy and debate. And the person who really is most responsibility for the sort of beginning of this movement to change the way the war and the history of Japanese colonialism is taught in the public school system is a man named Ienaga Saburo, who he's a historian and he writes textbooks. His big textbook is the one called A New Japanese History, and his textbooks were censored, and he took the government to court and spent years and years and years on this long court case. It gradually moved its way up the system, and he finally won in the Supreme Court eventually. But his lawsuits brought attention to public education and around this history of how do we teach the history of World War II? How do we teach the history of violence, colonial violence? How do we teach the history of the empire. And public school teachers take up the cause in a big way. The main teachers union is actually quite left-wing. It's affiliated with the Japan Communist Party, and they become, real activists in a campaign to embrace war responsibility and to teach. And as part of this sort of never again, we're going to teach the next generation of Japanese to understand not just its identity as a victim, but now victimizer. So it's victim's consciousness. Now we need victimizer's consciousness. And that's part of this movement. And the government, which is throughout the post-war period, run by pretty much single part dominated over and over again by the Conservative Party, the LDP, which wins election after election. And so the conservative government pushes back hard on this. And so you have this political polarization around these war memory issues that really begins in the 70s, but it's going to be a feature of domestic politics from this point onward. And then finally, just it's around this time in the 1980s that this whole issue begins to be internationalized. So in 1982, the mainland Chinese government, the People's Republic of China, for the first time through official diplomatic channels, objects to some of this censorship in Japanese textbooks around the China War and some of these issues, terms and the Nanjing Massacre and numbers and so on. And this kind of inaugurates a new diplomatic and international dimension of the textbook wars and of the politics of war memory. So that happens in 1982. And then in 1987, 1987 is a big year because it's the end of martial law in Taiwan, and it's the beginning of democracy in South Korea. So both of those countries have a big political opening. And they also begin to get sort of involved in the diplomacy of the textbooks and use that issue as a way to criticize Japan. So in the meantime, while this is all happening, the peace nationalism is being eclipsed by what I call economic success nationalism. So what else has been happening in the 60s and 70s? Well, those are the periods of high growth in Japan, double-digit income growth. And that leads to Japan's rise as the single non-white, non-Western economic industrial power, world industrial power. And also Japan becomes, by the 1970s, a major trade rival with the United States. And so this begins to kind of change the tenor of the U.S.-Japan relationship. And for both America and Japan, the U.S.-Japan alliance system, the security alliance, continues to be a kind of an anchor of it's Japan. That relationship with Japan is the anchor of American policy in Asia, and the relationship with America is the anchor of Japan's foreign policy. All that continues, but the relationship has gotten a lot more tense, and part of this relates to what happens in the United States as a kind of a reaction to Japanese economic growth, because the surging growth leads to trade friction over Japanese exports of cars and of electronics in particular, and so and the ways in which that this intersects with the kind of decline in American industrial capacity and the kind of rusting out, the beginning of the Rust Belt in the United States, creates a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in America. It's expressed in the labor movement, where there's kind of a lot of hostility towards Toyota. Here we see workers smashing up a Toyota car, but also this sense that Japan is a danger to the United States because Japanese companies are buying up real estate, they're buying up American dollars, they're buying up American movie companies. Actually, this probably sounds really familiar to you because this is very similar language that we hear about China today. But this was the kind of way people taught Japan in the 1980s. And the narrative there was that Japan's trade invasion was what was causing American industry to fail. There was a lot of criticism of Japan as a cheater, that Japan got a free ride on the U.S. security umbrella, but took advantage of American generosity by inundating the American market with cheap goods and underselling U.S. manufacturers. Japan was accused of being a cheater because it was an economically closed country and engaged in unfair trade practices. And of course, there was an element of truth to some of these criticisms, but there was also an element of racism in the way that they were expressed. So how does Japan react to this? Well, the prime minister of the 1980s, a man named Nakasone Yasuhiro, he was prime minister for quite a large part of the 1980s, sort of put his stamp on that period. And he and his allies in government and in the academy pushed back hard against these criticisms, which they delegitimized and grafted very effectively onto the Japanese public's kind of victim consciousness by branding this. They branded all of these criticisms as quote unquote Japan bashing, Nihon bashingu, Japan bashing. And the narrative here of Japan bashing was that the American bully is unfairly bashing poor Japan for just producing good products. The American bully is jealous of Japan's economic success, jealous of Japan's good work ethic. Americans are blaming Japan for their own failures, for their inability to produce good quality products, of the fact that they are inferior to Japan, and they're blaming Japan just because Americans are lazy themselves. And there was here also an element of truth to this narrative, to these accusations, but there was also an element of racism in the criticisms that Nakasone and company were making of the United States. And one of the things that Nakasone does in this period is he pours a lot of resources into promoting a cultural explanation for Japanese economic success. So, the question, why is it that Japan is number one? And the answer is not unfair trade practices. No, Japan is number one because it has strong institutions and good Confucian values. And the values of family, of harmony, of community, all of these are part of, the Japanese family, the Japanese community, the way the corporate culture, the familyist orientation of Japanese firms, and the Japanese political culture, et cetera, et cetera. These are the claims that are made about Japanese culture. And Nakasone sets up this new research institute called Nichibunken, the International Research Center for Japanese Studies, in 1987. And he stocks it full of conservative philosophers and historians and cultural scholars. And they proceed to research this whole problem of Japanese culture and cultural exceptionalism. And a lot of them have explicit links to pre-war kind of ultranationalism and Japan. And they churn out all this research that focuses on the unique Japanese path to modernity, and explain why Japan is the only the only non-Western society to develop successfully. And so there's a lot of highbrow philosophy that comes out kind of making this point, and it generates in turn an entire industry of uniqueness of the Japanese publications. So these two things, grievance politics against the U.S. and grievance politics against the U.S. for its anti-Japan rhetoric, plus the popularity of this cultural explanation for economic success, together shapes this new economic success nationalism. And I want to just give you one example of one of the promoters of economic success nationalism, a man named Ishihara Shintaro. So Ishihara Shintaro, I love that picture of him. So Ishihara Shintaro is a really he's like one of the most prominent right-wing politicians and hugely influential, a big pundit too. And he writes this book called The Japan That Can Say No. And it comes out in Japanese in 1989, and then this English version comes out in 1991. And it just, was a bestseller in Japan and in the United States. So a hugely influential book. And he argues, so the Japan that can say no, and why Japan will be first among equals. And he argues that, basically the quality of U.S. goods is low because the level of their workers is low. And Japanese workers are superior because their education is superior, but also because their character is superior. And part of the reason that Japan is superior, according to Ishihara, and this is a sort of a general element of this new economic success nationalism, is that Japan is a racially homogeneous country. Let's just set aside the fact that that's not the case, but that Japan is racially homogeneous. Everybody's the same, and America is inferior because it's a racially it's a mixed race country, and that really dilutes the character. And this argument that he's making kind of links the quality of the products to the quality of the workers to the quality of the culture, and says America's inferior, Japan is superior. But he's also at the same time, he's like this sharp critic of American racism, and he accuses Americans of being white supremacists who engage in cultural imperialism, and makes the case that the United States dropped the bomb on Japan and not on Germany because of racism. So this is kind of gives you a flavor of this, of one, pugnacious version of this economic success nationalism, with the kind of combination of grievance politics against the U.S. with this culturalist argument about economic success. And this brings us to the belated politics of apologies, the belated politics of apologies. So many people ask, why is it that the Japanese refuse to apologize, and what's their problem? And often you hear these kind of invidious comparisons made with Germany, where Germany is said to have been really good at coming to terms with its history, and Japan has just done a really terrible job. And we can just set aside the question of whether or not the Germans have done a good job in coming to terms with their own history. But I think that the point I'd like to just sort of make here is that these claims about Japan's inability to acknowledge their past is really not quite accurate. And indeed, the 1990s were a decade of intense self-reflection about war responsibility and war crimes, and of official apologies to Asian victims of war and imperialism. And the thing that sort of sets this off is 1989, the death of Emperor Hirohito. And so Emperor Hirohito was the he was the wartime emperor, and then he was also the post-emperor, and that signals his death signals the end of the Showa era, which had gone from 1926 to 1989, and so his reign bridges the war and the post-war, and really reconnects the two. And his death opened the floodgates of personal memories and of retrospects. So just the media and bookstores and television programs and are just filled with. I mean, I happened to be in Japan that year doing my dissertation research, and that was everywhere were these retrospectives on the Showa period, which was christened the turbulent Showa period. And it was productive of a mood of remorse and atonement that came expressed in a series of official apologies in the 1990s by Japanese officials. And the first one out of the gate was the new Emperor Akihito, the Heisei Emperor. And he expressly wanted one of his first official acts to be to sort of do a reset with Asia. And he wanted to make an apology. And so he did. And then he also traveled to Asia. Here is a picture of him by the Great Wall of China. And when he traveled, he made a point of expressing remorse. And he really wanted to kind of embrace the symbolism of remorse and attach it to the imperial house. But he was followed by the prime ministers, and there was just a series of them: Miyazawa, Hosokawa, Murayama, Hashimoto, Obuchi. They all gave an apology, and there was a pretty politically unstable period, the 1990s, and so there were a lot of changes in prime ministers, but they all gave some kind of an apology. Now, were these full-throated, comprehensive apologies? No. Were some of them marred by kind of weaselly qualifications? Yes. But nevertheless, I think it's quite striking that each of these Japanese prime ministers felt it necessary to make some kind of official statement, reiterating and just sort of a touchstone, touching again that feeling of remorse for the war and acknowledging the suffering of Asian people at Japan's hands. But this, again, as we saw earlier in the 70s and 80s, the sort of movement to acknowledge war responsibility triggered a backlash. And the backlash came in the form of the patriotic education movement that really ramped up in response and called explicitly for an end to apologies. No more apologies. They said, this is just not healthy for the country. And the patriotic education movement was led by a man named Fujioka Nobukatsu, who declared, he said, look, if the Japanese are not proud of their own country, they will not be respected in the world. We should not keep apologizing because it just invites other people to mistreat us and to look down on us. And he wrote his own textbooks, and he fought with the left-wing Japanese Teachers Union. He fought with the left-wing university professoriate over what he saw as excessively negative narratives of modern Japanese history. And he was really great at coining these kind of buzzwords. So he was the one that coined the term the Japan-hating Japanese and the term masochistic education that became really kind of resonant phrases of this period. So now I'm going to move to my last chronological period, the period from 1995 to the present. And this is the period that I am kind of calling regional rivalries and imperial nostalgia. And so now again, there's a sea change in attitudes. What touches this off? What's the trigger? Well, the trigger in this case is Japan's economic slowdown and the so-called lost decades that begin in the early 1990s when economic growth basically flatlines. Which is just an enormous shock to the sort of public psyche. So basically what happens is that from the late 1980s, there's this rapid, inflation, a stock market boom, everything's going gangbusters. And then the asset bubble bursts in 1991, and it turns into deflation, and then it turns into negative growth. And then it doesn't ever correct. It just keeps going on and on and on. And it's, this is really, so the early 90s are, beginning to be kind of sort of shocking, that's being, kind of difficult. And then you have 1995, which is this just horrible year. And the first thing that happens in March of 95, this murderous cult, a doomsday cult called Aum Shinryo, mounts this attack in downtown Tokyo, in the center of the business and political district. They leave 5 bags of nerve gas during rush hour, planning to just kill millions of people. And it didn't kill as many people. Fortunately, they were able to. It wasn't as bad as it could have been, but still, 13 people died and almost 6,000 people were injured in these 5 coordinated attacks, 3 different train lines. And the thing, it was just such a shock because on multiple levels, first of all, what was wrong with Japanese society that there was an organization like this? Why did it turned out that they were networked into the police and into the military and into high levels of, elite academia, and they'd been active for decades. And so it was a shock. How was it that the police weren't onto these people? And and then the government seemed unable to initially really bring them to heel because they were protected by Religious Freedom Act laws. So that thing was a disaster. And then there was the Kobe earthquake. So the sarin gas attacks in March, April, the earthquake. And this was another just horrible thing. 40,000 people injured, hundreds of thousands rendered homeless. It was Japan's Katrina. The government reaction was horrible. They didn't take care of the people. They, blew the crisis response. They were just paralyzed. It turned out that, so many people died because the building codes were just flaunted because everybody, because of corruption and mismanagement. And together, these 2 events, the sarin attack and the earthquake, just exposed that the government was not this great manager of the economy and, something to be proud of, but was just totally incompetent and sclerotic. And so, and at the same time, what was wrong with Japanese society? Culture. This wasn't a moment of cultural pride. This was a moment of cultural shame. And so it really punctured that economic success, nationalism, and the idea that Japan was number one, that it was a model for Asia and the world. So that happened in 95. Then, meantime, the economic crisis goes on and on, year after year, decade after decade. So wages are falling, growth stagnated, zombie banks, take over the financial sector. There's cuts to the social safety net, workers fired from lifetime employment. And this protracted economic crisis really punches, punches holes in things, and it's especially traumatic for this group of people known as the lost generation. These are people that grew up. They were born in the 70s and 80s. They were born into, the height of Japanese economic success. Japan is number one. They thought that they were entitled by their birth rate to, continue to enjoy a high consumer lifestyle and to be able to have lifetime employment. And instead, they're pitched. They don't have lifetime. They're pitched out into these low wage, precarious jobs, and so it creates a huge, just a generation that are filled with resentment and disappointment and a no future. And so this gets, and I'll sort of try to wind this up here by talking about restoration nationalism. So this gets expressed into, kind of channeled into restoration nationalism, which looks backwards with this, based on these calls to bring back the glory days of post-war Japanese high growth and economic success. And restoration nationalism is expressed in Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's program of economic rejuvenation, which he brands Abenomics. The whole point of Abenomics is to bring back the pre-collapse economy. And in addition, so that's part of the restoration nationalism. But another really key element of it, and this is sort of the last thing that I want to leave you all with, is that restoration nationalism develops out of the dramatic shifts in regional geopolitics in this period, driven by China's extraordinary rise, which is starting in the late 1990s and really accelerates in the early 2000s and has continued to accelerate. But also the economic success of Japan's former colonies, Taiwan and Korea. And so what begins to happen is that the economic rivalries between China, Japan, and Korea and Taiwan are become displaced onto those history wars and onto the history and how to interpret the history and legacy of Japanese colonialism. And so from China and from South Korea, from China, kind of stirring up anti-Japan riots and demonstrations around these history issues. And in South Korea, the whole emergence of the comfort women as a really sharp diplomatic issue, and compensation and reparations for the comfort women, as well as forced labor. And then in Japan, there is a kind of rise of a new kind of grievance politics and nostalgia for the good old days of empire, where you have a whole bunch of books like animated novels and weekly magazines and movies that express this nostalgia for the good old days of empire and traffic in racial stereotypes and hostilities. And the most prominent example here is this guy, Kobayashi Yoshinori, who writes animated novels. And he has the series of these three that come out on war, on Taiwan, and on Okinawa, 1998, 2001, and 2005. And they're just hugely successful. He's so successful. And he uses these manga to lay out in gripping narrative form this restoration nationalism, that Japanese colonialism was well-intentioned, that Japanese colonialism produced economic development in China, Japan, China, and Taiwan and Korea, and And it was because of Japanese colonialism that those countries have the economic success they enjoy today. The books kind of say that the accounts of atrocities are made up or exaggerated by liberal media, and that in fact the Pacific War was a war of liberation to drive European colonialism out of Asia. And they express these books. This new sort of restoration nationalism expresses a sense of grievance and victimology towards Asia. Why is it that Asia hates Japan so much? Japan has given Asia everything. We gave them economic success. We've apologized a million times. They won't accept the apology. And now they're just bashing Japan. This is just Japan bashing. So it's kind of repeating that phrase to belittle and to delegitimize the legitimate elements in that critique that's coming from Asia. And Abe Shinzo, the current prime minister, is really a kind of vocal proponent of all of this. And if you want to get a sense of it, here's his book, Towards a Beautiful Country, published in Japanese, and here's the English translation, which expresses a lot of this kind of sentiment. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for listening to me for such a long time, and I'm really looking forward to any questions or comments that you have.
All right, thank you, Professor Young. That was really fascinating. We'll turn now to audience questions. If you have a question, please just click the raise hand button at the center bottom of your screen. And after I call your name, you'll see 2 new buttons appear that allow you to unmute yourself and turn on your camera. Barb, did you want to, give me 1 second. Barb, did you want to go ahead? Barb, the buttons should be at the bottom of your screen, a camera button and a microphone. All right, I'll ask a question and then we'll come back to you, Barb, if you still have a question to ask. So I'm wondering about this question of reparations. You mentioned that that South Korea has made it a sort of a diplomatic overture to get these reparations for the comfort women. Have other former colonies of Japan also asked for reparations, and how has that gone over with the government?
So that's a really great question, and the whole thing has gotten very, very heated recently, and part of it, goes back to the early the initial post-war period, that first period that I talked about, the looking the other way period, when Japan normalized its relationships with South Korea, with Taiwan, and with mainland China. It's never normalized its relationship with North Korea, and part of the the terms of that normalization was that all of those countries, the states, kind of gave up their claims to any more reparations, and in exchange, they got a lot of money from Japan. So, like the dictator of South Korea, Park Chung-hee, he got this huge influx of money, loans, and grants. And instead of passing those on to victims to compensate the victims, he used those to bolster his own, for economic development and for his own pet projects. So as a result, he said, okay, we don't need any more reparations. But the actual victims, the actual Korean victims, they never said that's okay with us. And so then after the fall of the dictatorship in '87, this whole thing resurges its ugly head, because there's a whole bunch of people that say, they were forced laborers, they were these women that were forced into the brothel system, the sort of the comfort women or the sex slaves in that were forced to service Japanese soldiers in China. All of the victims, all the Korean and other Asian victims, they never signed on to that, and so now they wanted to, and so after the fall of the authoritarian governments and the beginning of democracy, it opens up an opportunity for them to start pushing claims for reparations. And that's really the beginning of this movement among the former comfort women and their feminist allies in South Korea, but also in Japan, to really try to push for some reparations and some acknowledgement of what happened. And they've had some success through legal channels, but it's still a work in progress, I would say. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Any other questions? You can raise your hand. All right, Mike.
Hi there. Yeah, I just had a question. Coming up in August, it's going to be the 75th anniversary of VJ Day, which is obviously the end of World War II. How is that being followed in the Japanese press at all, or what's Japan's reaction to like this huge anniversary coming up?
That's a really good question. And, to the extent that I've been following the Japanese news, I haven't seen a whole lot about that. I think that Japan, like the United States, is completely consumed with the whole COVID crisis. And to the extent that and kind of the relations between the whole diplomatic relations with the United States and with other countries regionally are so they feel so problematic and dangerous to people. So you just hear a lot of alarm in the kind of public press. It's there's a sense that, so one of the things that comes out of VJ Day is the beginnings of, the end of the war period. Usually it's a sad thing because Japan was defeated, but also it's a happy thing because it's the beginning of a real democracy and a kind of an economic success story without militarism and without, fighting aggressive wars. So usually it's seen as a success story, but anchoring that are things like the U.S.-Japan alliance system. And there's just, a sense that Trump has really withdrawn from that, and a sense that Trump's withdrawal, the Trump administration's kind of withdrawal from Asia and refusal to really promise to, continue to extend that nuclear umbrella over Japan creates just all kinds of uncertainty. So I think people are, I don't know. I'll be, I guess I don't know I don't have a specific answer to your question, except to say, I think that a lot of the discussion of the actual thing will get deflected by this other big crisis that's kind of right in front of people, plus a sense of that now Japan is facing the need to kind of remake the foundations of its orientation towards the world, because Japan can't have any faith in the U.S.-Japan alliance structure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? I'll ask one more because I find this topic so fascinating. So you mentioned at the very end of your talk, Shinzo Abe and his government's this like rise of a new grievance politics. Has that politics and this sort of like romanticizing of the colonial era and Japanese imperialism, has that resulted in policy moves or in sort of, yeah, what are the policy consequences of that narrative that they're
Yeah,
spinning right now?
that's a really good question. So, one thing is that I guess one thing is that it links up with a willingness to think about remilitarization. And there have been definite moves in that direction. And I remember a few years ago when Abe changed. So there's a lot of talk about constitutional revision, for example. And this was really a shock to me because I had always thought that it was the third rail of Japanese politics that you couldn't talk about constitutional revision. You couldn't, and constitutional revision means Article 9, means changing the terms of Article 9 of that commitment to not, the state doesn't have the right to wage aggressive war. And so this has always been a little bit of a, there was some sophistry involved in Article 9 and in the so-called peace constitution, because of course Japan does have an army. It's called the Self-Defense Forces, and it's one of the biggest armies in the world, actually. It's like number 5 or something. But nevertheless, there was a commitment. We're never going to spend more than 1% of GDP on the military, and also there were just real limits on the army couldn't be sent overseas in any kind of active combat. It could only be used for backup, and so. But this new kind of hostility towards Asia underpins when it gets connected up with China's saber rattling around the South China Seas and kind of Chinese expansion, territorial and militaristic language, and the whole Chinese bridge and road, or the tunnel bridge and, I guess it's the bridge and road initiative, where they're building all these infrastructure projects. And they've just been very kind of both at this point, both Japan and China have been rivals for claiming some kind of regional leadership. And so I guess that's one area where that new ideology really is getting pumped up. It's getting revved up because of this feeling of hostility and rivalry with China. And at the same time, relations have never been as poisonous with South Korea as they are right now. It's just horrible around this whole issue of the Korean, some South Korean victims have taken Japanese companies to court in the South Korean system, and asked them to make reparations for forced labor. Companies like Mitsubishi, and the Japanese government maintains that they're going back to that 1965 normalization treaty. And they say, hey, this was all done. This is a done deal. You have no legal recourse to do this. And the South Koreans are saying, yes, we do. And their Supreme Court found with that they could just take some of this, claim this from Mitsubishi Holdings in South Korea. So it's gotten incredibly ugly. And again, sort of the context for that is these narratives that just fuel a sense of grievance, like how dare they be trying to tell us that we already signed this, we've apologized a million times, and get over it. And anyway, why don't you should be grateful to us, kind of thing, really gets pumped up by those diplomatic issues. So remilitarization And then the whole nuclear issue with North Korea and the nuclear question gets into the mix as well.
Any other questions? If you prefer, you can also type your questions into the chat stream by clicking on the purple button at the bottom right of your screen. All right, Xiang Yup, go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for your great and fantastic discussion and presentation. I just like to ask you a very quick and general question. I was just curious about the role that the United States played during the whole Cold War era in this complicated and conflicting kind of relationships between U.S., Japan, and Korea and China, because you talked about the normalization between Japan and Korea in 1965, and that could be understood as a decision by the Pak administration for his development, but some South Korean historians understand that there was a American pressures behind the scenes, and also recently the comfort women issue, the pact signed between the Korean government and the Japanese government in 4 or 5 years ago was also some Koreans believed that there was the U.S. government try to push South Korean government to kind of have a reconciliation with Japanese government for a kind of to create a kind of economic bloc against the rise of China. So I was just wondering what role U.S. played, in this.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that absolutely in that early period in the 1960s. I mean, at that point, the U.S. had both Japan and South Korea were kind of client states of the United States in a lot of ways. The U.S. had troops in there. The U.S. Both countries were heavily dependent on U.S. purchases through the spending for the Korean War and then the Vietnam War. A lot of that was keeping both South Korea and Japan afloat, and both governments, recognized that. There was American advisors, military advisors, and political and economic advisors that were in kind of having a lot of influence over internal decisions in both governments, and both South Korea and Japan were then and continue to be militarily occupied. Huge numbers of American troops in those countries. So you can't say that that there's really a truly independent. It's hard to have an independent foreign policy when your security policy is so heavily integrated in that way. And the United States really wanted, from that time, it was in their interest to, the part of the reason that they pushed this normalization was that they wanted to step back from, having so much direct economic responsibility. They wanted to kind of channel things through Japan. So they wanted to use Japanese capital as the way of jump-starting some of the export-led development and economic modernization of Korea. They wanted to do that through Japanese capital, and Japanese capital was interested in that as well because they wanted to get a foothold into the South Korean economy. And Pac was fine with it as long as he got kind of bought off. So there was a lot of collusion that was part of American Cold War, imperialistic policy in the area that was the framework for all of this, and allowed PAC to squelch the domestic opposition, because there was a lot of outcry about this, as I understand, within South Korea. A lot of people did not want this thing to happen, and they thought it was quite unfair. And there was some discussion about whether these funds that Japan was channeling into South Korea could get used to compensate victims. And the United States, I think, partially didn't want that to happen. They just wanted it to get used for economic development, because that was going to bolster PAC's authority and also make South Korea a kind of a strong market-driven economy in the United States sphere. So that was in the U.S. interests. So the U.S. does play a really powerful role in it then, and still, fast forward to today, I think, of course, the U.S. doesn't have anywhere near the same kind of authority or power. It's just the relationships are much more equal now. So the U.S. can't tell South Korea and Japan what to do anymore. But there is a strong interest in the United States in keeping the kind of integration of American, South Korean, and Japanese military forces, that those stay strong as a bulwark against Chinese militarism. So I think that, I don't know the specifics of it, but I wouldn't be at all surprised that the United States put a lot of pressure on the South Korean government to accept, what Japan was willing to give on the late, that 1994, there was a 1994 settlement, kind of provisional settlement of a fund for of compensation for the comfort women. Do you have a different story about it?
No, I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, final call for any last questions. All right, in that case, thank you so much, Professor Young, for spending this time with us here today and for teaching us all of this really interesting history, and reminding us of sort of the long legacies of these histories in our current moment. Thank you so much, everyone else as well, for joining us, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful opportunity. Okay, and thanks for the great questions.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.